Everybody's talking about the NCAA tournament, what Pitt needs to do to get into the tournament, and we've certainly got questions about that in today's mailbag, plus questions about the spring game, questions about assistant coaching hires, questions about Blake Hinson, and lots of other stuff. Great questions as always, like we always have, and I can't wait to jump into it. So let's get it started with the Morning Pitt Mailbag right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Yeah, it's Friday. You know what we do on Fridays. We take questions from the Pitt fans on Panther-Lair.com, and we answer them, or as many as we can, here in the mailbag edition of the Morning Pitt. We do this, of course, right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. That is our YouTube channel where we put all kinds of Pitt video content, whether it's these daily Morning Pitt videos Monday through Friday, our weekly live show that we do every Wednesday night at 8 p.m., live post-game shows that we do after every road basketball game, press conferences, interviews, highlights, all kinds of things, all kinds of videos for you as a Pitt fan to consume. And they're right there, right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. You want to make sure you don't miss any of our YouTube videos, any of our Pitt video content. Subscribe, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Subscribe button's right down there. So just click that thing and you can get on board with it. It doesn't cost you anything. There's no obligations or anything like that. You just subscribe, and that's awesome. Also, we ask you to like this video because I like seeing those things too. And then, of course, you know the website, Panther-Lair.com. It's written below, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. It's the most comprehensive source of Pitt sports news on the internet, football, basketball, and recruiting. You find it all at Panther-Lair.com and message boards to interact with hundreds and thousands of other Pitt fans. All day, every day, Pitt fans are hanging out at Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. That's where Pitt fans go to get all the Pitt sports coverage. It's where they go to interact with other Pitt fans, to have those conversations. And it's where they go to submit questions for the mailbag. Every, usually Tuesday or Wednesday, we put up a post, a new thread on the message board, the Between Fifth and Forbes message board at Panther-Lair.com. You put up a new thread there that says, hey, give us your questions. And then people fill out that thread with a bunch of questions that we then go through and answer right here in the mailbag edition of the Morning Pitt every Friday. So let's jump into it. Great questions as always. And we start with one of the regulars for the mailbag, Smenges. First question got in there. He posted this question like an hour after I put up the thread. So pretty quick turnaround on this one. Asks, has Blake Hinson met, exceeded, or not met your expectations for this season to date, and why? A great question. I hadn't really thought about it in these terms for a while. I hadn't really thought about, what kind of an overall, assessment of Blake Hinson's season to this point. I hadn't really put it into those terms or thought about it that way. I know at a certain point this season, he was falling short of my expectations. Just bringing up his game log here to look at it. I think there was a point where he wasn't shooting all that well. He had 9 points in the home loss to Duke. He had 12 points against Syracuse in the next game. He only had 11 points against Carolina, 11 points at Syracuse, 5 points against Purdue-Fort Wayne. He didn't exactly enter the calendar year of 2024 in a hot streak. 5 points against Purdue-Fort Wayne on 2 of 10 shooting. 11 points at Syracuse on 3 of 12 shooting. 11 points against North Carolina on 4 of 16 shooting. He bounced back with a 21-point game at Louisville, but then he scored 9 against Duke on 3 of 8 shooting and had 12 against Syracuse on 4 of 17 shooting. But that 7-game stretch since then, which is a big topic of conversation. It's certainly, if you check out the 3-2-1 column this morning, I emphasized these stats in the 7 games since that Duke game when he shot since the Syracuse game at home, when Hinson shot 4 of 17 from the field, he scored 12 points. He has been on fire, just like everybody else. He's averaging 18.7 points per game, 5.3 rebounds per game. He's shooting 52.3% from the field over the last 7 games. He's shooting 46.4% from 3 over the last 7 games. Inside the arc, he's shooting 63%, 19 of 30 over the last 7 games. He has been on fire. He's got 3 20-point games in there, a 24, a 21, and a 27. He's been sensational, and he's got his season numbers now up to the point where he's averaging 18.3 points per game, 5 rebounds per game. His rebounds are a little bit off from where they were last season. Last season, he was averaging or he averaged 6 rebounds per game, but only 15.3 points. Now he's averaging 3 points more per game than he did and 1 rebound less. But I kind of think that's okay because they're getting more of a, as we talked about in the preseason, we talked about expecting this team to have more of a group rebounding effort, and that's what they're getting. So Hinson's averaging 5 rebounds per game, but Ishmael Leggett is the team's leading rebounder. He's averaging 5.5 rebounds per game. Bub Carrington's averaging 5.3 rebounds per game. Federico averaging 5.2. So you have 4 guys averaging 5 rebounds per game, plus Zach Austin averaging 4, Guillermo Diaz-Graham averaging 4.1. So that's 6 guys averaging at least 4 rebounds per game, and 4 of them averaging at least 5 rebounds per game. It's a group rebounding effort, and so Hinson's numbers have dropped there ever so slightly. But the overall team production, I think, is still really good in that regard. As it relates to Hinson, he's exactly where I expected him to be. I mean, like, exactly. He's doing what I expected him to do. He's filling the role I expected him to fill. He's playing as I expected him to play. Again, there was that stretch where he was below what I expected from him, but he has returned to the level I thought he would be at. If anything, he's exceeded it only a little bit, but I can't say like I'm looking at his play this season and, man, he's just so much better at this or that. I guess he's a little bit better at driving. He's doing a little bit more off the dribble. He's trying to attack a little bit more closer to the basket and using his strength to do so. But on the whole, I would say Blake Hinson has played almost exactly as I expected him to play. You know, if you look at my preseason expectations for him, what I thought he would be able to do, I'd say he's right in line with it. Right in line with it. Next question. SV Pig 1 says, who's the breakout 2024 football player that nobody's talking about this year? So these questions always kind of like, they're always tough to answer. I mean, we always have this kind of question, whether it's on the message boards or in a mailbag, or, you know, if I do like a radio hit or something like that, people, you know, who's that guy nobody's talking about? And it's always tough for me to answer that because I'm on the message boards at Panther-Lair.com all the time, right? I'm in all those conversations with you guys. We're always talking about this stuff. And I feel like there's nobody that we're not talking about. I feel like everybody gets talked about a lot. Every, you know, significant contributor. So I guess if we're talking about guys who have not been significant contributors in the past, you know, that's a conversation, I guess, to have. And I think there might be some options there. But it sort of feels like there aren't a lot of guys who are under the radar for the most part, because we talk about all of these guys all the time on the message board. So it's sort of a unique question or a uniquely difficult question to answer. But I do think there are some candidates. You know, Jacob Bernowski, when we talked to him, the new tight ends coach and special teams coordinator, we talked to him on Wednesday. One guy that he was very effusive in his praise for was Jake Renda. Said he's unbelievably athletic. Said he's really committed to working hard. He's in the film room all the time. He's studying. Maybe that's a guy to keep an eye on. You know, as a player who can maybe add a different element to the passing game, sort of a hybrid tight end, you know, / big wide receiver, athletic tight end / big wide receiver. Maybe Jake Renda is a guy to keep an eye on who could contribute here this season. He'd be a guy who has not done much in his career to this point, but maybe, you know, he's one that could potentially break out playing in a, you know, behind Gavin Bartholomew, but also sort of next to him in a different kind of role than maybe what Bartholomew might end up playing. I don't know if you know, he's definitely a guy that we don't talk about much, and he could have a breakout season. I sort of feel on defense, it kind of seems to me like, even though he was one of Pitt's best players last year, I feel like Solomon DeShields is still a little bit under the radar. I don't see us really talking about him as much. I feel like we talk about the defensive line, we talk about what corners are going to step up, and that's certainly an element too. And you're talking about breakout players, guys who you know are that nobody's talking about. I mean, there's a lot of corners on this roster, but none of them have played, none of them have done anything, and so somebody's going to have to break out there. Somebody's going to have to step into a starting job and play there. I'm just not sure who it is, but I feel like Solomon DeShields probably should get touted a little bit more than he has. And maybe I'm running the risk of treading on the Bengali Kamara territory from last year, where I just hyped him up so much and he fell short of really heightened expectations. But I mean, I think Solomon Shields had a really good year last year. I think he was one of Pitt's best defensive players in 2023. And I think he should be in line to build on that this year and be one of the defensive leaders again, and not just leaders off the field, but leader in production. He should be an impact playmaker and one of the better linebackers in the ACC. See, I'm doing it. I'm building up Solomon Shields like I did with Bengali Kamara. Is this going to blow up in my face like it did last year? We'll find out. But I think he is a guy who is in line to have a really big year. You could say last year he broke out, and I think that's probably the case. I think that would be accurate, but I still think he could probably even do more and break out even more than he did in 2023. This next one is, I looked through this several times. Panther and Wahoo fan posted this. There's no question mark in here, so I'm just going to read it. Even though this is the mailbag, we're taking your questions. I'm not sure what the question is, but I think it's a topic to discuss. Panther and Wahoo fan says, I feel like an under-discussed cause of Pitt basketball metric struggles is its non-conference scheduling. Granted, they had 4 non-conference Power 5 games on the schedule, but Pitt's other wins were North Carolina A&T, South Carolina State, Jacksonville, and Binghamton, among others. Ultimately, it comes down to wins and losses, and I think if they close strong, they're in good shape for a bid. But I can't help but wonder what our metrics would be if we replace some of those games with games against teams like George Mason, St. Joe's, or Ducks for cover, Duquesne, from the A10, or even 120-ish net teams from conferences like the MAC, MVC, AAC, or CAA. I felt like we had the same issue with last year's schedule, and the ACC was pushing to reduce these games to help the conference's net. I'm sure it comes down to money. We might even need to agree to a home and home, but I think it's more than worth it to have a stronger non-conference resume and avoid those ugly low-end quad 4 games for a better chance of making the tournament. So, again, there's not really a question in there, but it is a topic that's worth discussing of how does Pitt's non-conference schedule influence the perception of Pitt right now? And perception is probably not even the right word, because I think the perception right now of Pitt is that they're playing really well, that they've got some big wins. I mean, I think the general, the casual fan who's forming a perception of Pitt is going to look and say, well, they went to Duke and they went to Virginia and they won both of those games. Holy cow. And they were rather comfortable in both wins. This is a pretty good team. I think fans probably think even less about the non-conference and early part of the schedule than the committee does. But it seems it's still a factor that gets brought up. It's still something that gets brought up by, college basketball pundits and bracketologists and probably ultimately the NCAA tournament selection committee as they try to put together the field. There's a balancing act for coaches to find. And I think this is going to become the case even more and more over the coming years. But there's a balancing act when you're going to have a young and or inexperienced and or new team that you're going to try to schedule to that team. And conversely, if you have an experienced team, a lot of returning starters, a lot of guys who have played together, you're going to schedule to that team as well and try and stack up some quality win opportunities in the non-conference. Jeff Capel hasn't confided in me about this, but I would suggest that he probably put together this schedule, the parts that he had control over. He obviously didn't have control over the Legends Classic or the ACC SEC Challenge game, but the parts that he put together that he had control over, I would say he did so with an eye toward having a team with, most notably, a bunch of freshman guards and inexperienced guards. Even with Dior Johnson on the roster, it was a team with really no experience in the backcourt. From some of the main guys you were going to be counting on with Bub Carrington and Jalen Lowe and Dior Johnson. And so I think there had to have been some thought given to that. I think that had to influence the scheduling practices at least a little bit. Now, the thing is, going forward, you're going to have newish teams pretty much every year, given, just the movement through the transfer portal. You're going to lose guys, you're going to add guys. And so even if you're not relying on freshmen, you still might be relying on new players, and that could create some hesitation just when it comes to, do you schedule a tougher non-conference knowing that you're going to have a team that's still gelling and coming together and trying to find itself? Is it worth taking a risk against a team ranked in the top 100 of the net rankings that could potentially be a loss, as opposed to just stacking wins and letting your team find itself against lesser competition, even if that hurts you on the resume side of things later on. It's a balance, and I'm not really sure how, maybe if you swap one of those games out, I don't think you make wholesale changes of like the games you mentioned, dropping North Carolina A&T, South Carolina State, Jacksonville, and Binghamton for George Mason, St. Joe's, and Duquesne. I don't think you make a wholesale change, but maybe you swap one game out. Maybe you drop SC State and add Duquesne, or you drop Jacksonville and add St. Joe's, or something like that. I don't know. I don't know where that balance is, and I think that's tough. And it'd be a good question for Jeff Capel. Actually, I'll try and remember that the next time we talk to him, not necessarily in a post game, but after maybe one of the midweek interview sessions. It'd be an interesting question about scheduling practices and philosophy and approach. H2P_JC says, what are your thoughts on the D-line hire? How is he viewed as a talent developer and recruiter? Don't think I've seen any in-depth thoughts for you or Jim yet. Any rumored names for wide receiver coach? As we sit here on Thursday, haven't really seen anything about the wide receiver coach. I wrote about it in the 3-2-1 column of what I would hire, who I would hire for the wide receiver coach position. So you'll have to read that to find out. Haven't really been able to dig too deeply into Tim Doust just yet. He obviously has the respect of Panther-Lair. I think he worked with Corey Sanders as well, and I think he's there's a lot of respect there. Probably, I would think. I'm going to be honest, and I talked about this on the live stream on Wednesday night. So like these assistant coach hires, okay, like fine, we'll see what happens. I don't think there's anybody that comes in that jumps off the page and like, wow, look at this guy's connection to this or what this guy has done with that. And there's nobody, I know that, with some of these guys coming from the FCS ranks or G5 level or whatever it may be, that doesn't jump off the page and like, wow you. I don't know if it's necessarily a death sentence that it's a putrid hire either. I just can't get too moved by it. The thing that moves me, the hire that matters the most, and the one that's going to have the most impact on Pitt's success this season is the offensive coordinator. That's the one that really matters. And that doesn't mean we should ignore Tim Doust and Jacob Bernowski and Jeremy Darvo and Lindsey Lamar and whoever gets hired for wide receivers. But it's all secondary to whether or not Cade Bell works out. And so, we broke in and did like a film breakdown of Cade Bell's offenses, like a 4-part film breakdown. Great stuff from our guy Josh Hammock. We're not going to break down Tim Doust's defensive line. We're not going to do a film breakdown on that. Now, we'll look into it and see what we can find about who he's recruited and who he's coached and kind of how that worked out. But it all feels like this season is going to be determined by how well Cade Bell's offense worked. That's what it's going to come down to, whether or not Cade Bell's offense works. And next season is going to come down to whether or not Cade Bell's offense works. And ultimately, the next stage of Pat Narduzzi's tenure as Pitt head coach is going to depend on whether or not Cade Bell's offense works. Far more than it has anything to do with Jeremy Darvo and Lindsey Lamar, Jacob Bernowski, or Tim Doust. And those guys are all important. They all have to be good at their jobs. But I'm just not quite as moved by those hires as I am by the offensive coordinator. It's the single most important position on this coaching staff. Period, point blank. The single most important position. Of the 10 assistant coaches, none is more important than offensive coordinator. Pitt Chag asks, when does Pitt basketball get its first 2025 commitment? Will it be before Peach Jam? It's interesting. You ask that question and I have to sort of reset myself into thinking about 2025 basketball recruiting. I mean, we're running articles on it. Houston Wilson, our guy at Panther-Lair.com, has had a couple articles on guys this week. One of them is going to run today. 2025 targets, guys that are finishing up their junior years that Pitt is after, monitoring and targeting and pursuing and recruiting and all of that. But here again, it sort of feels like whatever happens there, and they'll get some commitments. But it feels like whatever happens there is overshadowed by the real personnel moves of significance this spring, which is the transfer portal. In both parts of it. Who do you retain? Who do you hold on to? And who do you add? Who do you lose and who do you add? You know, that like retention and addition are the two big components of the transfer portal, and I'm not sure which one's more important. Entering this offseason, retention may be more important than addition for Pitt, because it's going to take serious investment, support, and resources to keep Bub Carrington and Jalen Lowe. And that's not me sitting here digging into some deep, intel that I've got. It's just, you look around college sports, and if you have a Jalen Lowe and a Bub Carrington, it's going to take some serious NIL cash to keep those guys. And it doesn't reflect on them. It has nothing to do with them. It's just reality. You have freshmen who play like those guys are playing right now. If you want them to come back next year, it's going to take some serious investment. And so that is going to be like priority number one before we start even talking about any other transfers, before we start talking about 2025 recruits. And the coaching staff will be working on all of those things at the same time. But the most important thing to happen this offseason, the most important thing we're going to watch, is whether or not Jalen Lowe and Bub Carrington come back to Pitt next year. Because it's a very real question. Because they will have opportunities to go elsewhere. They'll have... I feel like not even bothering with like the talking around it. I mean, other schools will be trying to get them. And that'll all happen through second parties and third parties and fourth parties and all that. But other school, or I guess you don't really say second parties, right? That'll happen secondhand. It'll happen through third parties and intermediaries and all that. Nobody will ever actually talk directly to anybody. But it's going to be real. It's real. And Jeff Capel already knows it. I would almost guarantee. I mean, those guys know what they're going to have to deal with. So you see the Pittsburgh basketball club starting up a basketball-focused NIL operation. It's going to take serious support and resources to keep those key pieces of this roster together. And those are the two key pieces. So that's what I'm looking at. And I mean, they'll probably get a 2025 commitment later this spring or this summer or something. Getting 15 and 7 back, that's the most important part. Let's see. Last one here. Austin26 says, given the new offensive install this spring, what are the chances Panther-Lair.com forgoes the draft and plays 1s versus 1s, 2s versus 2s in the spring game? Well, they dropped the draft last year. They didn't use the draft format for the spring game last year. It was the first year that Panther-Lair.com's been at Pitt that they didn't use the draft. They just went offense versus defense. Used the scoring system where you get points for first downs. You get, defense gets points for 3 and outs and TFLs. Obviously, you get points for touchdowns and things like that. And that was the format they went with. I would assume they'll go with that format again this year. I think, getting away from it, I think Panther-Lair.com probably liked what he got a little bit more in terms of the matchups and, not sort of getting that jumbled up offensive line and all that. They're going to have a lot of guys in spring camp. They might have close to like 80 guys available in spring camp. So you should have depth to run through like a full 1s versus 1s, 2s versus 2s, offense versus defense situation, maybe even down to 3s versus 3s. But my guess is that we'll see them go with offense versus defense again, follow the format that they used last year, and go with that as opposed to going back to the draft. The draft was fun. It was interesting. It didn't necessarily create the best product. Not that last year's draft was not that last year's spring game was a great product, but it was a little bit better than previous year's spring games have been. So that's my guess. We'll see what they end up doing. We'll have a lot of practices this spring to talk to Panther-Lair.com about it and see what he has to say. I was going to say I bet he'll be cagey about it, but I could see him just saying it right off the bat. No, we're going to stick the same thing we did last year. So makes sense. All right, that's all the questions we're going to get to today. There's a couple left over. We'll get to those next week if we need to throw those in. But thanks, everybody who participated in the mailbag. Thanks for submitting your questions. It's fun, as always, to answer those. Remember, if you want to be part of the mailbag next week, you need to go to Panther-Lair.com. Keep an eye out next Tuesday, next Wednesday for the mailbag thread, and you can post your questions there. We'll answer as many as we can during next week's mailbag edition of the Morning Pitt. Like this video and subscribe so you don't miss any of our Pitt video content. We'll have coverage from Pitt Louisville tomorrow night at the Peterson Event Center. Coverage on Panther-Lair.com and YouTube.com/Panther-Lair.com. So thanks for watching the video today. Hope you had a great week, and hope your weekend goes well. We'll maybe we'll see you at the game tomorrow night, and we will definitely talk to you on Monday morning on the Morning Pit right here, YouTube.com/Panther-Lair.com.